Questions I get is about my stencils and why the lines are dotted. To answer this, it's important that I explain why I choose to trace my stencils by hand and not with a digital stencil filter. Tattooing portraits and realism in general relies heavily on the accuracy of details and values, with an emphasis on the importance of values. For example, on my Heisenberg tattoo, I could have used Procreate to create a stencil in a minute or two, and it probably would have come out a lot more lifelike and readable to most people. While I do see the value in digitally created stencils, I personally find them less effective for realism, especially when it comes to portraits. In my experience, the main drawback is that they can be overwhelming because of the excessive detail, leading to mistakes in value since they often lack clear distinctions between prominent areas. But that's not to say they don't have their place. I actually use them in the majority of my portraits for the hair because they capture the details more accurately than if I had traced them by hand. But when it comes to facial features, stencils are our maps, they're cheat sheets. If I'm trying to navigate a map, I want it to be uncluttered, coherent, and organized. That's why tracing your stencils by hand is so important. It allows you to familiarize yourself with it, giving you a deeper understanding and feeling of preparedness. By taking an hour or two to trace your stencil by hand, you're effectively memorizing the entire reference, making subconscious mental notes. You're studying your upcoming project, which in my opinion is an obligation for creating a good tattoo. Another important reason to trace your stencils by hand comes down to the accuracy of values, as I said before. Digital stencils will often create an accurate reproduction of details depending on the resolution and contrast of your reference, but it will not accurately define your values and the transitions between them, which are far more important for creating a true-to-life tattoo. Here's a few examples of what I mean. As you can see for the Heisenberg stencil, I'm starting off by making a clear outline of the entire portrait. I've made sure to make the outlines slightly more bold than the rest of the stencil. This helps to keep things organized. From there I'll move inward, making important notes of values and details without over-cluttering. I then trace the entire shirt and neck area with very bold lines, as I don't want these lines to disappear since I'll be partially skipping over this area during the actual tattoo. The reason for this is to use my initial energy on what's important, which is accurately capturing the face, but more on that later. From there, I start working my way up to the face, beginning with the bottom of the beard. For this beard, I decided not to rely on a digital stencil filter, as I find it would overclutter my workspace and confuse me during the actual project. Once I finish the bottom portion of the beard, I move on to some of the important wrinkles and shapes on the lower cheek. I start by outlining the main creases in the area with a bold line, and then work around them to establish where the shadows end with a dotted line. What I'm doing is looking for prominent shapes and simply marking them. Think of it like painting by number. As you could probably tell, the reason for using dotted lines, full lines, bold lines, and thin lines is to make sure the stencil is as readable as possible, so you don't get lost as you're working. From there, I move on to outlining the top right side of the beard and the dark shadow on the lower right side of the nose. As you can see, I'm jumping from part to part, leaving certain areas for later. As long as you don't forget any areas, doing it this way is completely fine. After finishing the outline of the nose, I make notes of some of the very light shapes I see, and outline the highlights on the tip of the nose to mark where the lightest point is. This will help me sculpt the shape of the nose as I work. At this point, I go back to the beard and make a clear distinction between where the beard ends and where the skin below the lip begins. So I trace a dotted line to make that separation. I then trace another dotted but smaller line for the bottom of the lip. The reason for the difference in the size of the dotted lines is again to keep the stencil as organized as possible. If every line were the same in terms of thickness and separation distance, I get lost as I worked, so it helps me to keep a clear picture of what goes where. For example, here I trace the mouth opening where I decide to make the line bold and only partially dotted. After that, I make subtle reminders of the creases in the lower lip and their direction. Remember, I'm not trying to note every individual detail. If I did, my stencil would be a mess, and I'd end up putting too much focus on unimportant details. Once the mouth is done, I finalize the shape of the beard and begin making notes of the direction of the beard hairs. As I do this, I notice that the darkest area of the beard is very evident, so I decide to trace it to differentiate the dark area from the highlight on the edge of the beard. Going back to the right side of the cheek, I start to look for aspects of the portrait that I'll easily be able to identify while I'm doing the actual tattoo. Here's a great example of how different line sizes can highlight key areas. You can see I'm using a bold dotted line to frame this section, serving as an obvious reminder as I'm working. The nose can be one of the more difficult areas to tattoo, so it's crucial to make this part of the stencil as clear as possible. Make sure to take as long as you need to determine what shapes are the most obvious and therefore worth tracing. Here, again, I'm simplifying the values into distinct shapes, setting myself up to approach the portrait with precision and efficiency. Once I finish the nose, I begin to carefully map out what I see on the left cheek. Since this side of the face is much lighter, it's crucial that I make only minimal markings to avoid overcrowding the area. Over time, I found that overcomplicating stencils, especially in lighter areas, can be a real issue because it can lead to spending too much time trying to capture every individual detail, which in turn risks over-darkening the entire space. One important trick that I use whenever I trace a stencil is to adjust the curves to exaggerate the lighter values and make them more noticeable. This is a quick and effective way to reveal areas that are important to trace but might get overlooked. Before moving on to the eyes, I start by tracing the glasses. I focus on carefully tracing the exact curve true to the reference image, using Procreate's straightening tool to keep the lines precise. Then I simply duplicate the line as needed until the glasses are complete. Now it's time for the most crucial part of the stencil. Eyes are one of the most difficult but rewarding features of a portrait, so it's essential to approach this carefully, ensuring we don't overcomplicate the stencil, keep each line true to the reference, and choose the right line size and spacing. The feeling of working on a tattoo and realizing your stencil is either lacking information or confusing is an unforgettable one, so it's important to make this perfect. Now that I've traced the general shape of the eye, I move on to tracing the less obvious details like the lower eyelid and eyelashes. From there, I simply trace what stands out like the wrinkles and the noticeable shadows. Notice how I don't trace every single wrinkle in the area. Remember, it's important that we don't become obsessed with marking every small detail or you'll have an overcluttered map when you print it on the skin, especially if you try to size it down for a smaller location like an inner forearm. I then continue to sharpen the eye, adding more information like the outer edge of the eyelid and some of the lower eyelashes. When it comes to eyebrows, this stencil was made a little differently compared to how I usually approach them. Typically, I make a bold outline contouring the entire shape of the eyebrow to help me understand where to end it off. In this case, I decided not to because they were relatively easy to gauge with the glasses overlaying them. If I had to choose between outlining the shape of the eyebrow or tracing the direction of each individual hair, I'd almost always choose outlining it. Now that the key parts of the eye are done, I finalize any remaining details like these nose pads. From here I move on to the left eye, repeating the exact same process. The next step is the forehead, where I start by tracing the major creases and wrinkles. I then size down my line and increase the separation between dots to take notes of the subtle values and some small wrinkles. Now that the majority of the forehead details are in, I trace the larger values which are crucial for giving the portrait depth. I also choose a significantly bolder line for this part. This is a technique that I find is often overlooked. Because of the amount of detail in the area, it's easy to overlook larger values like this. After that, all that's really left is to stencil in some of the remaining details and trace the hairline. I ended off by marking where the shading should end at the bottom of the shirt. If you're interested in replicating my brushes on Procreate, I'll show you how to make them yourself. Just duplicate the gel pen and add it to a new folder. Then increase the streamline stabilization to 100%. After that, just duplicate it again around 5 times and adjust the spacing more and more for each brush. It should look something like this when you're done. Mastering stencil creation is just as important as actually tattooing. Now that we've covered stencils, let's move on to skin prep and stencil placement.